or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, if you want to watch us, you can do so on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, I'm Charlotte Morgan. The government's rejected the idea of conscription following comments made by the head of the military. Sir Patrick Sanders says Britain should train a citizens' army to prepare for a possible future war. Major General Jonathan Shaw has told LBC he agrees.
The Russian threat is back. In fact, it's not just a threat, they're actually out there fighting. Two things need to happen. One, we need to replenish the stocks of ammunition and equipment that we've given the Ukrainians. And secondly, we need to ramp ourselves up to a position where we're a capable force.
Police say the deaths of a woman and two children who were stabbed near Norwich are now being treated as murder. Jasmine and Natasha Kaczynska were aged 12 and 8. Detectives say the death of a 45-year-old man who was found with them at a house in Cossey is not suspicious, and they're not looking for anyone else. Ofcom insists there needs to be a conversation about the future of Royal Mail. Rishi Sunak says he's committed to keeping deliveries 6 days per week, but the media regulator says that's unsustainable. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 41 points at 75.27. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.16. LBC weather: rain spreading across southern England and Wales tonight, reaching Northern Ireland by dawn. Clear elsewhere with a low of 1. Bright in the north and east to start tomorrow before becoming cloudy. Outbreaks of rain moving in at times with a high of 13. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. 2 minutes past 8 is the time. Wednesday's Cross Question. On the panel for you tonight, we have George Monbiot, columnist for The Guardian and environmental campaigner; Kirsten Oswald, SNP Women and Equalities spokesperson in Westminster and MP for East Renfrewshire; Greg Swenson is chairman of Republicans Overseas UK and works in investment banking; and Dean Russell is Conservative MP for Watford and former business minister. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask them a question over the course of the next hour. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Lily in Three Rivers in Hertfordshire. Hopefully none of them flooded, Lily.
Yeah, fortunately the flooding hasn't hit us too bad.
Good. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, so I was wondering, why does the government still have money to fund tax cuts when they still haven't got enough money to fund our crumbling public services?
I think this is a question that a lot of people are asking and thinking, well, if this wasn't an election year, Dean Russell, would there be tax cuts?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, the argument consistently has been, let's get the economy into a better shape. You know, the pandemic has massively hit us, so has the war in Ukraine, which has global impact. But my view is very different, perhaps, from some, which is that the idea that it's an either-or. You either spend some money on the public services or you do tax cuts. My take is that a tax cut goes back into the people's pockets. They'll spend that money and they'll spend it in shops, they'll go and spend it in other ways. So eventually it goes back into the economy. So tax cuts don't necessarily mean less public money in the greatest scheme of things. It just means that people get to take more home, they have more choice on it. I believe in a smaller state and I believe in a lower tax. But that's not because I don't want the state to support people. I want people to be able to have the money that they've earned and then choose where they spend it and make sure that we're supporting the most vulnerable through welfare and other systems and the NHS, of course. So for me, it's not a zero-sum game. We have to make sure with tax cuts we're giving people the opportunity to keep their money, but then they'll be spending it anyway, so they'll be using it in other ways.
This time last week, your colleague Craig Tracy was sitting in that seat, and I asked him to name one public service that had improved since 2010, and he really struggled to answer the question. And that is really, I think, behind Lily's question, where I don't want to put words into her mouth, but I suspect she sees a lot of public services which aren't working for her and thinks, well, hang on a minute, if more money were invested in them, they might work better rather than put it into tax cuts.
Well, my take, though, is you look at the outcomes. Crime is down. We've got more people in employment. We've got lower unemployment. We've got so many things that are going on that actually, when you look at the facts and the stats, are in a better position. I get why people feel that things aren't quite right. And, we've come out of a pandemic where we've got to sort things out. But you look in my constituency in Watford, got £5 million to reduce rough sleeping. We had no rough sleepers for a period of time. I've got a brand new hospital coming. I've got the full funding for that. I've got my tips bill coming, making sure that people and workers get to keep their tips. There's so many areas. We've got a new police station coming. We've got more police. All of these things. So actually, if you look at the outcomes and the statistics and the data, there is more money opportunity there. But the truth of it is that we also need to look at efficiencies. And the reality is, when we look at these systems, one of the big bugbears people have is not when they see the doctor or the nurse, for example, it's the process of getting there. And that's why
if the Chancellor's got, say, £10 billion, which is rumoured to be between £7 and £10 billion, we hear from the social care sector that £3.5 billion would actually cure their problems and make sure that it was a much safer sector, that people are getting a better care service. Is it really possible to argue that £3.5 billion should be spent on tax cuts?
I think if you look in the round, though, the money will ultimately go back into the system. So what we have to do is look at how we spend it and how we do it efficiently, how we get to the better outcomes. So when it comes to social care, for example, there's big announcements today, I think, with councils getting more support on certain areas.
We'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay, great. So I think, it's not a zero option here. It's not a case that you do tax cuts and therefore you're totally cutting services. It's about how does that money get better spent. And I believe strongly that people should have that money in their pockets, but we do need tax. One thing, if I could just quickly say, it used to be that when you went up a higher tax band, it was a moment of pride. You were getting paid more, it was a good thing. Nowadays, tax seems to be this very negative thing, but actually paying more tax is a good thing, but we need to make sure that it's balanced so that people get to keep more for themselves.
Because you haven't increased the thresholds. Kirsten, I could kind of sense steam coming out of your ears then.
I just thought that Dean was perhaps living in a different world, a different reality to most of the people in the country. I don't think that most people would recognise this land of milk and honey which he's describing. People are finding things very difficult at the moment. They're having to make extraordinarily hard choices, really hard choices, ones that I suspect those of us around this table are not having to contemplate. And for MPs to sit there and suggest that everything is fine when we know that the cost of living crisis is biting, a lot of that lies at the feet of Dean's party. We know that Brexit has caused huge damage to our economy and to our community and our society as well. Things are very challenging outside of these islands. Things are very challenging for people in their own homes, and government is about choices. The choices that this UK government makes do not...
And your government in Scotland, of course.
Indeed, and well, let's look at that. So the government in Scotland has chosen to invest in making sure that child poverty is kept to the lowest level that can be managed by introducing the Scottish Child Payment, by increasing that. So research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others will absolutely back up that not only has the child poverty rate in Scotland now been significantly lower than across the rest of the UK, but that is making a material difference to families and to lives. And, I could go on and talk about the other benefits that people in Scotland have. You could also talk
about the rising tax burden in Scotland, where people are starting to move over. I mean, if you live in southern Scotland, you're starting to move over the border, so you pay lower taxes.
People are not doing that. Let me just conclude that why is it that the UK government won't replicate the Scottish Child Payment? What is it that isn't attractive about trying to drive down child poverty? That's the reality of these choices. And of course, most people in Scotland are absolutely not paying more tax, and most people in Scotland are seeing a significant benefit from all of the public services that are available to them, whether that's things like baby boxes, free prescriptions, free tuition fees at university. I could go on. Government is choices, and the choices that this UK government is making are cynical as they see that we are moving towards this election.
OK, Greg Swenson.
Yeah, I think, first of all, tax revenues will ultimately go up with tax cuts. You cut the rates, more economic growth, wages go up. It worked for John F. Kennedy in the 60s, it worked for Reagan in the 80s and Mrs. Thatcher, and it worked even for Trump in his first administration. So reduce the tax burden. More collectivism, more redistribution doesn't solve these problems. The best way to eradicate child poverty, which was done quite successfully in 2018, 19, 20, is economic growth and wage growth. And it just so happens that typically the wages, or at least in the last cycle, the wages that went up the most were the wages in the very identity groups that the Democrats in America claim to be their own. And so whether it was racial groups or income groups, so the lowest quartile, the lowest decile had the highest wage gains. The wealthier decile and quartile had the lowest wage gains, below the average. So, these are things that work. So we can tax more and regulate more and redistribute more, but collectivism doesn't work. So not only is it immoral, but it doesn't
if you
work.
were the Chancellor and you had £10 billion at your disposal, you would put the whole lot into tax cuts?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that would create more economic growth, and then the tax cuts pay for themselves. So this whole idea of the zero sum that Dean pointed out, it doesn't cost $3.5 billion. It might cost something in the first quarter or the first year. But once you see that the people keep more of their money in their pockets, they spend it, they hire people because they have more money in their small businesses, and then tax revenues ultimately grow. Okay. First of all, people's incomes grow, and that's the best part. But when people's incomes grow, tax revenues go up.
Well, if you're watching us live on Global Player and there was a wide shot then, you'd have seen George Monbiot shaking his head through Greg's entire answer. George.
It's all such a historical nonsense. When the NHS was built in this country, when we built the welfare state in this country, the top rate of taxation was 94%. That's why we were able to build these great institutions, even though GDP was much, much lower than it is today. It's because there was effective redistribution from the very rich into public services, and through public services, the creation of a social safety net which prevented the very poor from falling through the cracks. Now, the situation we face in the UK is of a country falling apart. The NHS is in permanent crisis. Schools are literally falling down, and it's pretty miraculous that none of them have yet fallen down on the heads of their pupils. That is just a piece of luck so far. Councils are going bankrupt. The rivers are turning into sewers because of a lack of investment in sewerage capacity and in water treatment. Sign after sign shows the result of a long-term failure of public investment, a failure which admittedly predates this administration but has become much worse during this administration. Now, we face the extraordinary situation where we see the collapse of public services and record levels of taxation, and we have to ask, where's this money been going? Sure, some of it caused by the pandemic. There have been other factors as well. But a lot of it has, frankly, been squandered. When you look at the VIP lane for PPE payments going to people like Baroness Mone, for example, and many other favoured friends of the Tory party. When you look at the staggering sums squandered on test and trace because it was handled in such a fantastically amateur fashion. When you look at the basically the patching up of public services, which very often costs you more than funding them properly, it's failure, failure, failure. What we need to see is the money that is currently being raised spent properly on public services rather than the current government
how do you do that?
Formula
because
of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
I mean, the government would no doubt say, well, look, we have provided X amount more billions for the health service. We give it to NHS England, and then suddenly it sort of disappears and the service really doesn't improve.
I mean, the truth is they haven't. There's pretty well an
£190 billion
spent
on the health service.
Listen, there's an international consensus that for a modern health service to be able to keep up with an ageing population and technological change, they need 4% a year above inflation. Currently, the NHS is receiving 0.5% a year. It has a £200 billion deficit. In other words, the money it would have received since 2010 had it had that 4% funding formula against the money that it actually has received. That's why the NHS is in crisis. That's why people are being treated in ambulances, because there's no capacity within the hospitals. That's why A&E departments are falling apart. That's why people are dying of diseases from which they should not be dying.
So where do you spend the 10 billion then?
Well,
not on tax cuts.
Not on tax cuts. I mean, we're spoilt for choice because there are so many aspects of public provision which desperately need that money.
I mean, you're absolutely right about that. But I wonder, from a governmental point of view, sometimes governments say, OK, well, we've got X amount of money to spend. We're going to spend it all on this to make sure that this can work in a way that it doesn't at the moment. And OK, we know that there are other things that it could be spent on, but we as a government are choosing to spend it on this. What's the one thing that you think needs funding most?
Well, I think as an environmentalist, I'd probably start with the rivers. I mean, it's just so disgusting. They are flowing with SH1T. I mean, hardly a river now. It's unaffected.
You can't actually say that word on this programme, and yet Keir Starmer can say it in Prime Minister's questions today. There's something wrong there, I think, isn't there?
Well, I haven't looked at the protocols.
Oh, well done.
Dean, I mean, obviously, OK, Greg agrees, you two agree, but is it a lonely position arguing this case in your constituency?
Not really, because when I speak to people, they're talking about cost of living, well, what's the best way of reducing cost of living? Well, it's bringing inflation down. It's about having more money in their pockets. It's about reducing taxes. I get the issues. I'm not blind to the challenges. During the pandemic, I used to volunteer every week, take shopping to people. I see the challenges and do a lot of work with those charities that help. But the truth is, if the argument is always we just need more money, as Margaret Thatcher said, eventually you run out of other people's money, and that's the socialist argument. I think Ronald Reagan made a brilliant point. It was in his speech after his first term, and he talked about it's not about left or right, it's about up or down. And the argument he was making is it's about creating new opportunity. The up is about seeing the opportunity, creating the opportunity, providing people with the ability to afford those new lives for their kids and that support. And the problem is with the left argument and the sort of socialist at the extreme is about spending other people's money in ways that they might not want it to be spent. So I think it's about helping support people. It's about putting the infrastructure in. But if the argument is constantly put more money in, guess what? It will get spent. And it won't necessarily get spent in the best way. So it's about using a business-like mind to get it right.
Yeah, I'm struggling with the notion that the UK government's actions are about helping people. They are assuredly not about helping people. We've only recently heard about their grand plans to make sure that disabled people must work from home. That's not helping people who are disabled. There are none of these magical jobs. I actually looked. I can tell you that these jobs don't exist. I was speaking to a disability charity today. They're deeply anxious. The people who they support are gravely concerned by this. It's a backdoor way of taking the support that people have away on this flight of fancy that there are some kind of store cupboard full of work-from-home jobs for people who are disabled and who actually need that support that they currently have. So let's cut to the chase. The UK government is not about supporting people. It's not about looking at what people need and providing it in their time of need. It's very much about looking at this election that's coming up cynically and playing to the gallery. I think it's deeply depressing.
Right, we'll move on to other subjects in just a moment here on Cross Question on LBC. It's 18 minutes past 8.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
How will people fall in love with the railways if their journey is disrupted by industrial action?
Straight to the point.
People would rather go to the dentist than vote Conservative.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Well, these are your candidates who totally disagree with you.
Listen on your radio and Global Player, the official LBC app.
minutes past 8. George Monbiot is with us, Kirsten, Oswald, Greg Swenson and Dean Russell. Let's go to our next caller. It's Khaled in Wimbledon. Khaled, hi.
Hi, Ian. Good evening, panel. Today, the London Borough of Havering announced that it's technically insolvent and we'd be looking for a government bailout, typically known as a Section 114 notice. A long list of councils up and down the country of all political persuasions are now in financial distress. And the government's obviously just announced an extra £500 million, which amounts to a couple of million quid per council across the country. Do the panel believe that, A, local government finance is in crisis? And do the panel believe that the reason for this crisis is the sticking plaster approach to local government finance and the chronic underfunding of adult social care provision, and the fact that 13 years of Conservative government has failed to address this structural problem of the underfunding of adult social care, which is rising year on year and is going to get worse as the population ages and more people get dementia and other illnesses?
OK, Khaled, thank you very much. I suppose we have to differentiate between councils that have been incredibly badly run and the more general subject of underfunding. Now, Kirsten, in the break, I asked you, was Scottish councils in this position? And you said, well, that they're not. Why are the difference?
I mean, I'm not suggesting that things are not challenging for people who are managing councils. I think that, we would all agree that they are, and, people are making choices based upon the funds that they have. They have, I think, been in a different position to the councils in England over a number of years, and that means that we're in a slightly different position now. But I would absolutely add my voice to calls for more funding for local government in England, because of course that funding then means that we have additional funding in Scotland, and that's something that we have been calling for. The UK government's funds that are going to Scotland are smaller in real terms than we either require and have had in the past. So, the decisions that are made here have a very adverse knock-on impact on how we do deliver local government in Scotland. But I take my hat off to local government colleagues who are, despite these challenges, managing to do a very good job of keeping the ship afloat and keeping public services and really important services for people in our local communities ongoing. But the more that this UK government plays lap fast and loose with funding, the more challenging that is.
George Monbiot.
Well, there are some standout examples of mismanagement. Some councils have done very badly and they've made some really stupid investment decisions, but that's not why the majority of councils are in trouble. There's a long-running funding crisis here, not just the funding from central government, but also the profoundly unfair and regressive fact that council tax banding has been stuck since 1991, which means that as time goes on and houses become more valuable, the rich pay a smaller and smaller proportion while the poor effectively pay the same.
Which actually George Oswald, in his podcast this week, was saying that he wanted to change this, I think in 2015, and introduce 2 more higher council tax bands, but was prevented from doing so by David Cameron, who said, well, we'll just be accused of doing a mansion tax. We don't do mansion taxes.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely illogical and insane, and this is the result. So basically what's happening, and this is happening right across the sphere of taxation, but particularly at the local level, that the tax burden gradually gets shifted more and more towards the middle and the poor, and less and less onto the wealthy, and the result is underfunding. Grotesque underfunding, long-term underfunding. Councils have been in crisis for a long time now. What's different today is that crisis is coming to a head. And I just want to say a brilliantly phrased question from Khalid, really nicely put. He's obviously got his finger on the pulse, and he's raised a crucially important issue.
Greg?
Well, if there's ever any government that I'd say is government function, it should be local government. I surely wouldn't advocate more centralized planning, more collectivism from the state, from Westminster. If local councils have a valid reason that they're underfunded and can make the case, great. I mean, if I were to advocate for any funding of government, it would be at the local level where those important services are done. They should be taxed at the local level as well. The best allocators of capital are not central planners in London or Moscow. They're usually at either the private market, the private sector is a much better allocator of capital, or for local governments where you need government services, where you need safety net, of course. I think that's a no-brainer. Reduce the size of the central planning and allocate out to the councils.
Because at the moment, I think it's 25% of money that councils spend is actually raised locally. The other 75% comes from the central government.
No wonder a lot goes to waste. That doesn't shock me.
I mean, you also need distribution between councils, because some councils have got a lot more money floating through them than others. And so if you have, if you just say all the funds got to be raised locally, that means that rich boroughs have loads of money to spend and poorer boroughs have almost none.
Dean?
Yeah, well, I used to be a district councillor, actually, a fair few years ago, and so I see the work that councillors do, and it's phenomenal. Many work full-time and are councillors as well, so I take my hat off to them all. I think when it comes to funding, we need to make sure that it's spent efficiently, it's focused in on the people who need it the most, and providing good services. The announcement that was mentioned earlier about the boost for social care, I think, is a really positive step, and I think that came up, in fact, in part because a lot of MPs joined their councils, as I did myself, and went to government and said, look, we need to get this extra support. I think when it comes to these things, though, we need to look at how it's spent and what the role is of those local government organisations. You have in the UK county councils, district or borough councils, you have town councils. They all have different levels and different roles, and I think what we need to do is make sure they're joined up better. And I think there's a real role there as well for technology. I remember years ago seeing how for the planning departments, for some, hopefully it's changing now, but they'd get an email in, put it on one system, then copy it to another system, then send a letter out, then send an email out, and it was just inefficient. And I think we need to look at how that better works. But I think there's a great role for local government, and I think it's an important part of our UK democracy.
Can I just stand up for the people who work in local government here? I'm not sure that Dean's comments reflect the reality. I think that the systems in many local councils are much more modern and up to date. Let's not bash people who probably don't earn a huge amount of money but are doing important work.
Fantastic
in our
pensions,
communities.
though.
Can I also come in on the social care point? Just briefly, I met with an organisation today and they were telling me about their struggles in terms of social care because of Brexit, and compounded by the ridiculous visa hoops which people have to jump through. If we want to have good social care, the first thing we need to do is to have people available to deliver that. And as things stand, no matter what people in government do, if there are not staff here to deliver social care, then none of these plans will be.
Perhaps the solution to that is actually increasing wages so that British people might want to do those jobs.
I think that the solution is allowing people who are able and willing to do these jobs to do them. We need and we welcome wages. More. Well, I think if you move to Scotland, you'll get proportionately higher wages for these kind of jobs, and we need people in Scotland to do that kind of work and to do other jobs as well.
So are you saying that social care in Scotland is paid much more highly than in England?
I didn't say it was paid much more anything, but we do have a fair work agenda in Scotland. We do look to organisations paying the real living wage. These things are really important in recruiting and retaining staff. So I agree with you on that particular point. But in Scotland, we want and we need people to do lots of jobs, including social care jobs. A lot of these people went home post-Brexit. They weren't welcome here anymore. That's certainly what they felt. And people who are now here, including people who perhaps have come from Ukraine, are being made to jump through hoops which are profoundly unhelpful to them and to organisations. They could be facilitated to do jobs that they want and that we need. And the UK government makes it very difficult.
Okay. We've got to move on, Dean, I'm afraid. I know you wanted to come in there because we have lots more questions to come. It's 8:31 on LBC. News headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
Downing Street says the government has no intention of calling up British conscripts for a possible future war with Russia. The head of the Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, says citizens should be trained up to boost numbers. The Chief of West Midlands Fire Service, Wayne Brown, has been found dead at his home. It's understood he was under investigation by the service following claims made on social media. And rising obesity levels among children as a result of the pandemic could end up costing more than £8 billion. A new study's found it rose significantly in England at the height of lockdowns. LBC weather, rain spreading across southern England and Wales tonight, reaching Northern Ireland by dawn. Clear elsewhere with a low of 1.
This is LBC.
Let me reintroduce my panel. Greg Swenson is chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, works in investment banking. Kirsten Oswald is SNP Women and Equalities spokesperson in Westminster and MP for East Renfrewshire. George Monbiot is a columnist for The Guardian and an environmental campaigner and has a brilliant book out, which I've read and interviewed him about on my All Talk podcast, called Regenesis, which is a great word, I think. And it's a really, really thought-provoking book. And Dean Russell is here, Conservative MP for Watford, former business minister. But Dean, you spoke very movingly, I thought, was it last week or the week before in the House of Commons, about a heart attack that you suffered in, was it August last year?
Yeah.
And I mean, how old are you? Because you're not
47.
47. You're a lot younger. I mean, it must have been a great shock because you don't expect to have a heart attack at 47. Do you know why you had one? And I mean, you've obviously recovered very well from it.
Well, I think the simple answer to why I had it was because I ate rubbish for many years and didn't exercise enough, and it's the boring and true answer. And
we're all now looking at our feet.
Yeah, absolutely. and it was a very weird experience, to share some of the symptoms for anyone listening, to your fantastic podcast. The truth is, I started to get a numbness in my arm. It sort of went to my chest, and then in my upper chest, and then on my back. And
over what period of time?
Over very short. It was over a matter of minutes. And but it wasn't like, so you have cardiac arrest, which is where you effectively your heart stops. But a heart attack, it's much slower. So an artery was blocked effectively. And but the care I got was incredible. But even though many years ago I used to work with the British Heart Foundation, they were one of my clients, and so I did a big campaign with them. So I knew instinctively that was what was a heart attack. But even for me, perhaps it's because I'm a bloke, perhaps because I didn't expect it, but I thought, it can't be. So I left it a little while, and then instead of calling 999, I called 111 because I thought they'll tell me to go to the doctors and take some pills. And when I spoke to them, the words came back, which was, there's an ambulance on its way. And I got took to the hospital, then I got moved to Harefield. I had 3 options given to me when I got to Harefield. I'm sat in the surgery area, and they said there's 3 options. 1, you'll get some tablets, we'll monitor for you for a few days, and you might be on something for the rest of your life. 2nd, you might have to have a stent, and they explained it. And the 3rd option might be we have to open up your chest and do open heart surgery. And I thought, let's hope it's number 2, and thankfully it was. I felt like I'd sort of won the lottery, so I feel very lucky. It was caught quickly, and then I've spent a few months recovering, during which time I was able to still work. I was told not to, of course, and I tried my best not to, but within 2 weeks I was at an event, walking around meeting people. It was scary, I have to admit. It was a searing hot day, and meeting people was unusual. But I thought at that time, I just thought, you know what, this is what I want to do. I know it sounds cheesy, but I'm an MP because I like to make a difference. I love people, and I thought at that moment I could either give up and shy away, be scared of my own body, or I'll crack on and keep delivering, and that's what I've done.
And you stopped eating rubbish? Hopefully.
Stopped eating rubbish. I've lost about 12 kilos, and I still have fish and chips every so often, or chips with my family, but generally it's just being a bit more careful.
Right, let's go to another caller. It's Francis in South Kensington. Hello, Francis.
Hello, good evening. Hello?
Yep, good evening. What would you like to ask?
What I would like to ask is, isn't it about time the Conservative Party, as a party on its last legs, just really, maybe in a very diplomatic or kind way, told Rishi Sunak the time has come to hang up the bra and just leave. And just take a bow graciously.
It's only been there about 15 months.
Yeah, but the thing is, he's a bright man. He would make a very good cabinet minister, but he's no prime minister material. And I really do feel, as a Conservative voter, I would have rather had someone like Kemi Badenoch in charge.
All right. Can we have a question?
The question is, don't you think it's about time he left?
Okay, so about time the men in grey suits, Greg, paid a visit to Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, look, you can go back to the election and say I would have voted for someone with more powerful conservative principles or not, but the reality is Rishi leaving now isn't going to save the party before the next election, like him or not. So I don't think that's a wise choice. I think...
Well, Francis thinks Kemi Badenoch would add a bit of vim and vigour.
She probably would, but I don't think it would work. And I don't think I'm not even sure Kemi would want to do that. There will be a time for leadership change, but I don't think it's right now because, you'd have to declare an election or it would be chaos between now and the election in December. So I think it would be a mistake. And again, that's not a judgment on whether Rishi Sunak will be looked back on as one of the greatest prime ministers of all time. But, this would be rather, I think, disruptive, to say the least.
George Monbiot.
I don't think it's Rishi Sunak who needs to go. I think it's the whole party. I think it's time.
A huge shock to us
for
all.
an election. I mean, all this sort of kerfuffle today about this article by Simon Clarke and should he step aside and someone else. This is a death rattle of a moribund party. This is what happens when it's completely run out of momentum, completely run out of ideas, completely run out of moral purpose. It's a bankrupt party. It's a party which is dead in all but name, and they will do us a massive favour if they just declare the end of this disastrous episode sooner rather than later.
I hope you don't mind me asking this, but as you know, I knew your parents in Norfolk, and they were very big Conservative Party activists. Your father particularly high in the voluntary party. What would they make of today's Conservative Party?
Well, it's quite interesting, actually, because towards the end of certainly my father, towards the end of his life, he became really disillusioned. I think it was when Boris Johnson got in. In fact, for a start, it was Brexit, which I was quite surprised that he came out as a Remainer, and he could just see what a mess it was going to be. And then when Johnson became Prime Minister, he just despaired. He thought, this isn't the party that I used to work for and fight for. And of course, we disagreed lots about politics. We had very different.
Love to have been around your dinner table.
Yeah, well, I think, in a way, I think he was quite happy that I'd made my own decisions, and and I hadn't just absorbed what the politics that was around me, but had thought about it for myself. And and he wasn't ashamed that I'd done that in any way. But we sort of came a bit closer politically towards the end because we both despaired of the Tory party.
Dean Russell, are you going to be a complete loyalist and extol the virtues of Rishi Sunak and why he'll win the next election?
It's not about loyalty as such. It's that I genuinely think he's the right person for the right time. I think the challenge we've had as a country requires us to get the economy right. And by chance you could say, but and I appreciate you might say, well, I would say that. But, I think if you take the corporate world, I worked in businesses for many years, there has always been a case where in the kitchen area, around the water cooler, even in the boardroom, there are complaints about the leadership. There's always any business. Ask anyone who works in any big company, that's the case. The difference in politics, those points are often made in op-eds, they're often made in comments, they're often made in interviews on TV and radio. It's no different. We have the same different views within a party, but actually I was with pretty much all my colleagues earlier for something, and the feeling in that room was that we felt united. And actually, if anything...
Simon Clarke, though?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know, actually, because I wasn't looking out for him. He's very tall and I'm very short, so I should have probably seen, but I genuinely didn't see. But my point, though, is that actually, I think in many ways, what it's highlighted is that what we're hearing on the doorstep is that people want to vote Conservative, but they've been frustrated with us, and I won't deny that. But they don't want to vote Labour. And I think even my esteemed colleague from the SNP would agree, Labour would be a disaster. There's no plan, and I know we say that a lot, but there really isn't, and there's no substance. And what we're getting on with, there's a lot of detail, a lot of work that may not always make headlines, it may not always look like it's the big statements, but actually we're getting on with the job and getting inflation down.
That's what politicians always... Theresa May used to come out with that one all the time, and it used to drive me insane. Well, of course you're getting on with the job. It's your job to get on with.
It is.
But that doesn't butter any parsnips at an election. Of course we expect our politicians to get on with the job.
And you're totally right, but it's coming out of the fact that we've had two massive shocks to the world. Ukraine and the pandemic has had massive...
Well, again, we all know that. We can all appreciate that. But again, for the electorate, they've discounted that. You can see it in the polls.
I get that, but what I would say, so in a constituency like mine, in Watford, and
it's a three-way marginal.
It's a three-way marginal, but if you look at what I've been able to deliver as a Conservative MP over the past 4 years, full funding for a new hospital.
Okay,
I've got my police.
You've said these things already, so I'm not going to let you repeat them.
But
Kirsten.
I thought that Dean had inadvertently missed the third shock, which was the disastrous mini-budget, maybe the fourth shock, which was Brexit.
He was recovering from a heart attack at that point.
Well, I'm not blaming Dean personally for these things, but it's definitely the responsibility of the Tory government, and it's an absolutely rotten government. It's a zombie government, really, isn't it? Let's not kid ourselves. They're so enmeshed in fighting with each other over the remnants of what was once there, and that's all at the expense of focusing on the things that they ought to be doing, and providing the support for people in a time that is very difficult. It's very difficult out there in the world beyond these islands. There's serious and significant problems. It's very difficult for people domestically, and they're busy fighting about whether they seriously are going to replace yet another failed Tory Prime Minister with someone else.
Well, to be fair, there's only two of them that apparently believe they should replace him, so it's not sort of ferrets in a sack like it was before.
I'm not confident that they are all enthused, but they have him, the sooner that we all have an election so that we can see the back of this government, the better. And in Scotland, of course, the way to make sure that there are no Conservative MPs in Scotland is to vote SNP. That's what the maths will tell you. Of course.
Well done for getting that in. Right, of course, in the next 15 minutes, we have our fun question, which if you were listening last night, you may have got a bit of a shock with what one of our panellists said. Let's see if we can outdo that tonight, shall we? There's a challenge to our panel. It's 8:45.
This is LBC.
Kirsten, Oswald, Greg Swenson and Dean Russell answering your questions. Here's a text question from Robert in Horsham. Why is Nikki Haley still bothering with her failing campaign? Now, of course, the former US ambassador to the UN was beaten by around 11% by Donald Trump in yesterday's New Hampshire Republican primary, but said that this race is far from over. Trump called her delusional and an imposter in response, which is presumably why he appointed her in the first place. Greg?
Yeah, it's a typical Trump banter. That's not new. That's not unusual for him. He likes.
After Iowa, he was very sort of inclusive.
I noticed that. He actually did a much better job of dialing down after Iowa and trying to encourage people to unify. But I think, he's got soft skin. So I think what happened is when Nikki Haley said that she was going to stay in the race in spite of losing, he was offended by that. And so I think, there wasn't really a lot of shock when we saw Trump's comments. The reality is she might not have a path right now, the way, when you look at things. And I think that's why Ron DeSantis got out on Sunday night. It looks like Trump is going to win the nomination. But it's still very early. I mean, these things usually happen after Super Tuesday when you see some, consolidation around the leader. It's really early. There's been 2 primaries. The other thing I just have to remind people is that Trump is almost an incumbent president. Now, granted, he got, 50 or so % in Iowa, and he got, pushing slightly more than that in New Hampshire. But normally, incumbent presidents win 90% of the support in the party. They don't even run contests when you have an incumbent. But now you have 2 incumbent presidents, neither one of which are called Trump a quasi-incumbent. Neither one of them are getting 90% of their own party. That's a bad sign. Normally, that would mean you're going to fail in the general election. But in this case, they're both failing. And so 21% of the surveyed Republicans in New Hampshire last night said that they will not vote for Trump in the general election. So it means half of Nikki Haley's voters will voted for Nikki, but will vote for Trump because they will support the party. But 21% say they won't do that. And that number was 15% in Iowa. If you're below 90, you lose in the general. But again, both candidates are in the same position. The best chance that Nikki Haley has is just to hang around, because you can't predict the unpredictable. Trump could, get into some health problems. He's 78 years old.
Court problems.
He can get a conviction. That might change the dynamics. Biden could drop out. If Biden drops out, you don't have that grudge match, revenge factor that's motivating so many Republican voters.
It's too late for Biden to drop out now, isn't it?
It is in the process. Like, he couldn't. It's too late to have a proper primary season for the Democrats. But he could just drop out and say, I'm not up to it. You're going to have to go to the convention and figure it out. So if Biden drops, Trump's numbers go down. So Nikki Haley, she got 9 delegates last night while Trump got 12. It wasn't a complete disaster for her. She did better than the polling that was coming out even in the last few days. It was Trump plus 20. The last 3 polls were 22, 22, and 27 for Trump, and it ended up being 12. She was also polling at 49 with independents ahead of Trump. He was polling at 41. No shock there. She ended up getting 60% of independents. So I'm not suggesting this was a major change, and it's going to it's going to encourage her to stick it out for the entire season and win. But she makes some sense by wishing to stay around. Just stick around.
Right. Brief comments from other 3 panelists. Kirsten.
I mean, it would be a positive change, would it not, to be talking more about women at the top of their political game in America. Nikki Haley is not someone whose politics align with mine at all, but it is a refreshing change to be thinking that there are women in the race.
There's a piece in the Times today about Trump's possible vice presidential candidates, and 3 of the 5 they profile were women.
And, I can't fathom how they could see their way to working with a man who I think has absolutely nothing to recommend him. I think he's a despicable character. But
don't trust
that's that's the situation. That's up to them. But I think it is encouraging to see that we are talking more about women, and frankly, talking less about Trump would only be a good thing from my point of view.
Dean.
Well, it's hard to commentate as a politician on other countries' politics, but I'll give it a try. I think it's dangerous, to be fair, that a British politician would be so slamming of a potential future president, though, because I think
it's
we've
entirely
got to work. Reasonable. Well, no, we've got to. There's a special relationship between the UK and between the US. I think that's important that sustains, and that's important to have a constructive relationship, even where there's disagreements. I think, as it was said, this is a long way away. Politics, a week's a long time in politics, as they say. Several months can change everything. So I think, for me, I'm watching and waiting, and I want to see if there was anything I'd like to see more support from Trump towards Ukraine. I think he will have an important role if he does win.
Good luck with that.
In that. But I think
he's certainly not going to do that.
But I think it's important to watch and make sure that whatever happens, that we continue to build a good relationship, which we've got now, I think, with the US, and it's got to keep growing.
Okay, George.
Well, I do hope something changes, because it's a horrifying prospect. This is a man who tried to overturn the result of the last election. It's a man who says he'll be a dictator on day one, a man facing 91 charges, a man who had a rape charge upheld by a judge as being substantially true. He's possibly the least suitable person in the entire United States to be president again. And yet things seem to be lining up such that he's likely to be.
Gives us something to talk about, doesn't it? Let's go to another question from Bradley in Swindon. Why, oh why, are we considering drilling for more oil in the North Sea? And don't say energy security, please, when it's just going to be sold abroad. According to government stats, around 80% of the oil produced in the North Sea is actually exported. George?
Well, why, oh why indeed. And in fact, the government has also conceded that that's not going to bring down people's energy prices either. So it seems almost to be like a statement of intent that, we intend to burn this planet. We're going to leave our mark, and that mark is going to look like a
But they say
blinking great
going to affect the net zero target by 2050.
Look. Everyone who knows about this, everyone except the climate deniers, including the International Energy Agency, which is no Greenpeace, says we have to leave fossil fuels in the ground if we are to have a chance of avoiding truly dangerous levels of climate breakdown. That's the only safe place to leave them, in geological strata. And the more governments license new fossil fuel extraction, as our government is doing, and indeed, unfortunately, Joe Biden's government is doing as well, then the more our chances of remaining within the slightly less dangerous bracket diminish. And we're pushing and pushing Earth systems towards potential collapse.
Greg?
Well, they should have done it a long time ago. The world needs fossil fuels, and fossil fuels have been liberating people for generations, and there's less poverty and more growth, and so many millions of people have.
Isn't that a short-termist view?
No, not necessarily. I mean, look, it's unrealistic to think that we can end the use of fossil fuels overnight. The only thing that
Who's talking about ending the use of fossil fuels overnight? Where did that come from?
Well, there need to be...
That's a total straw man argument. You plucked it out of the air. Nobody is saying we should be ending the use of fossil fuels overnight.
So we need to provide more fossil fuels at decent prices. The more hostility to the energy sector, George, the higher prices go.
I'm not remotely hostile to the energy sector, and I can tell you that renewables in this country are much, much cheaper than fossil fuels. If you're trying to heat your house with fossil fuels, you're spending a fortune doing so.
I hope you're not.
If you're trying to generate power with fossil fuels, you spend a fortune doing so. We make it much
wind
cheaper.
And solar when there is no wind and there is no sun. But
that people worked out how to do grid balancing quite a long time ago.
So you're saying that fossil fuels should be developed and sold around the world, but not here in the UK?
No, and say everyone should be developing and selling less fossil fuel. That is what the Paris Agreement says. That is what the great majority of governments have agreed to do. That is the only way we're likely to avoid truly dangerous levels of climate breakdown. And given that in the UK, renewables are now considerably cheaper than fossil fuels, there is absolutely no argument for extracting more.
Without subsidies, the wind and solar is cheaper and more efficient.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So let's ignore the argument whether we should end the use of fossil fuels for a minute. You're saying fossil fuels are okay.
No, I'm not saying fossil fuels are okay. I'm saying fossil fuels
shouldn't develop more of them.
They shouldn't have more, and we should be phasing out
an example.
those
the hostility
that we are
to the energy sector that started in 2021 when Biden entered office. All it did was make the swing price higher. The U.S. had become energy independent and the world's leading provider of energy, just like the UK was energy independent in 2005. But when the prices go up, guess who benefited? Venezuela, the mullahs in Iran, and and
This
Putin
is just
in Russia.
xenophobic
It's
nonsense. This is absolute trash.
Absolutely
Much as
true.
I'm
Fossil
enjoying
fuels
this
are burning
discussion, I
planet
have an
Earth
eye on
regardless
the,
of where they come
the
from.
clock. We literally
The
have
existential
90
crisis.
seconds for our final two panellists on this. Kirsten is gagging to speak.
Well, I hope there's not been a wide camera angle, because I've been sitting here with my mouth hanging open at some of this. Let's not engage in climate denial. Let's be real about the challenges that we
I don't
face.
think Greg was engaging in climate denial.
I felt that was where we were going.
Natural gas
and
liberation
well, if I
in
can
America.
finish, because I let you
Sure,
finish,
please,
Greg,
please,
if
go
you don't mind.
Can't wait.
But that's a little bit rude.
No.
It's
I
a
mean, I
really
can't wait to respond.
serious
Sorry.
situation that we're dealing with. And that exchange is profoundly unhelpful to anyone who's worried about the climate. And it's also unhelpful to anyone who's worried about renewable energy. I did ask about that in the Commons today, as it happened. And the answer, as usual, I'm sorry, Dean, was absolutely nothing. There was no answer on why the UK government can't do what the Scottish government's doing. People need that to happen, and so does the planet.
Dean.
Well, I think the strength of this argument and debate tonight has shown why it's so hard to have a proper debate, because people just get shouted down for having a view. The reality is...
I think with respect, George was passionate about this.
Passionate,
he didn't shout down.
Fair point, OK. But I think the problem is we need a serious debate on these things. But the truth is, the idea that importing energy from other places is better somehow, and the carbon emissions from that is better than making it at home, is, for me, I find really absurd.
So how about leading by example? How about leading by example, Dean? How does that work?
Well, I think we are leading by example in so many ways.
What, by drilling more oil and gas? You think that's leading by example?
I think we need to make sure that when we're arguing in the first question about cost of living, that we're making sure that the cost of living is going down.
Affecting cost of living. Your own government says this will not reduce energy prices for consumers.
Oh, how I wish we'd done this question earlier in the program, because I do